The Texas sun burned low, red and wide, the kind of heat that pressed dust into skin and made the air shimmer above the barbed wire. It was 1944, and Camp Huntsville stretched across the prairie like an island of fences. Inside, hundreds of German prisoners worked under the watch of young American guards. Ranchers turned soldiers, cowboys in uniform, who had traded cattle for captives. Among them was Sergeant Bill Harper, a tall man with a sun-scorched face and a Sesson hat that had seen more branding irons than bullets. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was slow and measured, like he was tasting every word before letting it out. Most days his job was simple. Keep the PS moving, keep them working, and keep them from thinking they were free. That afternoon the heat was merciless. The Germans hauled fence posts under a sky that looked like fire. One of them, a former Luftwaffe officer named Karl Weber, collapsed into the dirt. The others hesitated, unsure if helping him would be punished. A guard shouted, "Leave him, he'll get up." But he didn't. His hands twitched against the ground, his face pale beneath layers of dust. Harper stood still for a moment. Regulations were clear. No unnecessary contact with prisoners. But he'd been raised in a world where you didn't leave a man in the dirt. Whether he wore grey or khaki didn't matter. He walked toward Weber, boots crunching over dry grass. The German soldier stiffened, expecting anger. Instead, Harper knelt, took off his canteen, and pressed it into the fallen man's hand. "Drink," he said. The word was plain, almost gentle. Weber looked up, startled, before taking a sip, then another. And then Harper did something no one expected. He took off his SD-Son hat, the symbol of his pride, his identity, and set it gently on Weber's head to shield him from the sun. The entire work detail froze. Even the seekers seemed to stop humming. The guards watched in stunned silence. The Germans didn't move, unsure if this was mockery or mercy. It was mercy. When Weber finally stood again, his face red with embarrassment and gratitude, Harper said only one thing. "A man's got to keep his head cool." Then he turned and walked back to his post. For the rest of the day, the camp felt different. Something invisible had shifted. The guards didn't bark as loud. The prisoners didn't stare with as much defiance. Even the air seemed lighter. That night in the barracks, the Germans whispered about the cowboy who had given his hat to an enemy. Some laughed nervously, others stared into the dark, silent. VB sat by the window, the hat beside him on the bunk, unable to sleep. The wind outside carried the sound of distant cattle bells, and for the first time since his capture, he felt something dangerous. Hope. He wrote in his journal that night, "The Americans showed me respect today. I did not think that was possible in war. Perhaps this country is stronger than we imagined." And across the yard, Harper sat outside the guard shack, watching the stars scatter above the desert sky. He didn't know his small act would echo far beyond that fence, far beyond that war. He just knew he'd done what any decent man would have done. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with guns. They're fought between what you're told to do and what your conscience demands. Before Texas, before the barbed wire and the cowboy hat, there was smoke, steel, and the sound of engines dying over the Mediterranean. Karl Weber had once been one of the Luftwaffe's rising stars. At 26, he flew sleek Messmid Bf 1009 seconds, painted in silver and black, the pride of his squadron. He believed in the Reich, in duty, in the glory of the fatherland. The newspapers had told him that Germany would dominate the skies forever. He believed every word until the day his engine caught fire over southern Italy. The sky that had once carried him now swallowed him whole. He bailed out, the parachute snapping open like a scream. Below him, American soldiers watched from olive groves as he drifted down, helpless. The war that had once felt noble suddenly felt small, dirty, and inescapable. Captured within hours, Weber expected the worst. Propaganda had painted the Americans as brutes, men who killed prisoners who spat on honor. He braced for pain. Instead, a medic offered him a cigarette. A soldier poured him water. Someone even smiled. It was disorienting, almost insulting. From Italy, Weber was transferred by ship to the United States. The voyage was long, silent, and humiliating. Hundreds of PS packed into the lower decks, eyes hollow, the ocean endless. Rumors swirled among them. "They'll work us to death. They'll starve us." But when the ship reached New York Harbor, something astonishing happened. Civilians on the dock stared, but not with hatred. Some even waved. A week later, Weber was on a train bound for Texas. Out the window stretched a land unlike anything he had ever seen. Open, endless, almost defiant in its vastness. The train passed wheat fields, oil pumps, and cattle grazing under the sun. "Where are they taking us?" someone asked. "To hell," another replied. But when the train finally stopped, Weber realized that hell could be strangely beautiful. Camp Huntsville didn't look like a prison. It looked like a small town built from wood and barbed wire. There were barracks, a mess hall, even a library. The guards weren't monsters, they were farm boys and ranch hands, some younger than the prisoners they watched. Sergeant Bill Harper was one of them. He'd been raised on a ranch outside Amarillo. Before the war, his world had been cattle drives, fence repairs, and rodeos. He knew how to rope a steer, but not how to hate a man he'd never met. When the army assigned him to oversee agricultural labor from German prisoners, he laughed. "You mean I'm babysitting Nazis?" But when he first saw the PWs, thin, sunburned, eyes full of pride and fear, something in him hesitated. They weren't monsters either. They were just men. Still, discipline ruled the camp. Orders were strict. No friendships, no small talk, no mercy. Harper followed them at first. He called them krauts, kept his distance, and made sure they knew who was in charge. But he noticed things. He saw how Weber would quietly fix a broken wagon wheel without being asked. How the prisoners would hum folk songs that sounded eerily like Texas ballads. How when one of them stumbled, another would catch him. One evening, as the sun set over the prairie, Harper leaned on the fence, watching them march back to the barracks. The wind carried faint laughter from the German work crew. For a moment, it didn't sound like the enemy. It sounded like boys on a ranch doing a day's labor. In that brief silence, Harper understood something his officers didn't. You could strip a man of his weapon, his uniform, his rank, but not his humanity. Stay, when Karl Weber collapsed in the field, that understanding would become action. The first weeks at Camp Huntsville felt like being trapped inside another planet. For the German prisoners, everything about Texas defied their expectations. The air was dry and heavy, the land stretched forever, and the Americans seemed to live without fear or rationing. There was meat on every plate, coffee every morning, and cigarettes handed out like sand in the wind. Karl Weber couldn't reconcile what he saw with what he had been told. In Germany, civilians were hiding in basement from Allied bombs. Cities like Hamburg and Cologne were ashes. Yet here the supposed enemy lived with abundance, ease, and laughter. The guards listened to radios, danced to swing music, and complained about the heat, not hunger. Weber and his fellow Ps often whispered about it at night in the barracks. "They live as if the war doesn't touch them," one said, "as if they cannot lose." To the Germans, this calm confidence was more unsettling than any weapon. Across the camp, Sergeant Bill Harper noticed something else. These men, who had once fought ferociously under Hitler's banner, were now learning how to mend fences, cook in the mess hall, and handle cattle. Some still saluted each other, clinging to military formality. Others loosened, joking quietly in broken English with American cooks or farm hands. The boundary between guard and prisoner began to blur in the smallest ways. A cigarette shared across the fence. A joke about Texas weather. A song hummed during work, half German, half English. The war was still raging across the ocean, but here on the prairie something more human began to take shape. Still Harper knew his orders. No fraternization, no sympathy. And yet every day it became harder to see these men as faceless enemies. He'd seen one of them. Weber bandage another's hand after a work accident. He'd overheard them talk about families, farms, and fears. It reminded him of home more. War. One afternoon, Harper saw Weber standing by the fence, staring out at the open plains as if trying to memorize the sky. "Never seen a sky so big," Harper called out. Weber hesitated before replying in halting English. "In Germany, sky's smaller. Too many buildings, here it goes forever." Simple exchange stayed with both men. In the following days, the camp's rhythm softened. Weber began helping translate for guards who couldn't speak German. Harper stopped shouting commands and started giving instructions like he would to a ranch hand. The work went smoother, the tempers cooler. But beneath the quiet cooperation, an unspoken question grew between them. How could two men who were supposed to hate each other start to feel like equals? One evening, Weber watched from the barracks as Harper rode a horse along the perimeter fence, the setting sun turning the dust into gold. He had never seen anything like it. A man free, completely at home in his world. Weber envied him, not for his power but for his peace. Later that night, Weber wrote in his journal, "They live differently, not for the Führer, not for conquest, but for something harder to define. They are not fighting for a man but for an idea." For Harper, the realization came the next morning. As he watched the German prisoners work the land, he thought, "They ain't fighting us anymore. They're fighting what they were told about us." Two worlds had collided, one built on obedience and ideology, the other on freedom and individuality. And in that collision, something unexpected was being born: respect. Neither man knew it yet, but the day would soon come when that respect would be tested, when kindness would defy regulation, and the simple act of a cowboy offering his hat would turn enemies into friends. In the German barracks, discipline still ruled like a shadow. Even though the war was thousands of miles away, the prisoners kept their ranks, their salutes, and their silence. The officers enforced it strictly. Every man still lined up by rank, stood at attention during roll call, and saluted the commandant as if Berlin was still listening. To them, captivity was not an escape. It was a test of loyalty. Lieutenant Karl Weber obeyed the rules. At first, he had been raised under the strict order of Luftwaffe, taught that obedience was strength, but Texas began to change that. He saw the difference between control and leadership, between power and respect. Sergeant Bill Harper embodied that difference. He never shouted, never bullied, never used his authority to prove a point. He didn't need to. He carried himself with a quiet kind of confidence, the kind that came from knowing who you were. It was the cowboy way. Back home before the war, Harper's father had drilled it into him. "A man's worth ain't in what he owns or who he bosses around," he'd said. "It's in how he treats others when nobody's watching." On the ranch, that meant sharing water on a hot day, fixing a neighbor's fence without being asked, and always keeping your word. In the camp, that same philosophy began to guide him, even if it clashed with military regulation. When the commanding officer reprimanded him for giving Weber water and his hat, Harper didn't apologize. "Sir," he said simply, "a man was dying of heat. I helped him. That's what a decent man does." The officer frowned. "These men are the enemy, Sergeant. You're not here to play rancher." Harper met his eyes. "Out here, they're just men, sir, and I reckon they already lost more than a war." Word of the exchange spread quickly. Among the guards, it divided opinion. Some thought Harper was soft. Others respected him more than ever. Among the prisoners, it became a legend. They whispered about the cowboy sergeant who treated even his enemies with dignity. Weber couldn't understand it. Why show respect to those who had bombed your cities? Why show kindness to the people who had sworn to kill you? The German code of war demanded loyalty to hierarchy when no emotion, no hesitation. But the cowboy's code was different. It wasn't written down anywhere. It was just lived. As the weeks passed, Weber watched Harper closely. The man lived by instinct, by a sense of fairness that had nothing to do with rules. When a guard mocked an older prisoner for moving too slowly, Harper stepped in. "Ease up," he said. "The man's doing his best. No anger, no argument, just quiet authority that shut everyone up." Weber began to write again in his journal. "They do not follow orders because of fear. They follow because they respect each other. They fight not because they hate us, but because they believe in something. What would our war have been like if we had fought for that?" One morning, the German prisoners finished repairing a fence line early. Instead of sending them straight back, Harper let them rest under the shade of an old oak tree. He pulled a harmonica from his pocket and started to play a slow tune, something lonesome and familiar. The Germans listened in silence. Then one of them, a farmer from Bavaria, softly hummed along. The melody wasn't the same, but the feeling was. For a moment, no one remembered the war. There was just the sound of music drifting over the Texas plains, the sound of two worlds quietly learning how to speak the same language. Weber would later write, They call it the Cowboy Code, but it is something deeper. It is honor without cruelty, strength without hate. I am beginning to understand why they will win. By the autumn of 1944, Camp Huntsville had changed in ways no military manual could explain. What had started as a prison now felt like something in between a ranch and a small town. The air still carried the dry heat of Texas, but the tension that once filled every corner had begun to fade. The German prisoners had grown stronger, their fear replaced by a strange rhythm of daily work. They built fences, tended cattle, and helped harvest crops for local farms. To the surrounding ranchers, they were no longer the enemy. They were laborers, efficient and polite, who sang while they worked. The Texas sun, the smell of dirt, and the long days blurred the line between captor and captive. Sergeant Bill Harper noticed it most clearly during one of the harvest weeks. The PS were helping bale hay for a rancher named Davis, an old friend of Harper's. The job was hard, and the machines often broke. Harper saw Weber crouched beside a broken hay press, studying it. A few minutes later, he had it running again. Harper grinned. "Guess they teach you mechanics in the Luftwaffe too, huh?" Weber smiled faintly. "They teach us to fix things we break." For the first time, Harper laughed. A real laugh, not a guarded one. That small moment broke something invisible between them. Over the next weeks, more rules began to loosen. The PS started greeting the guards by name. Harper sometimes shared coffee with them after morning roll call. A few Americans even taught them English phrases. "Howdy, thank you." "Much obliged." The Germans in turn taught words like Kamerad and Gesundheit. The local townspeople, at first suspicious, started to change too. Some farmers volunteered to bring food to the camp. Others offered old books or newspapers. When the German prisoners returned from work crews, they talked about Texans who thanked them for their labor, even offered them slices of pie. Weber couldn't believe it. He had been told that Americans were arrogant and cruel, a nation of machines without culture or honor. But here they were, people who worked hard, laughed easily, and lived by an unspoken faith in fairness. In his journal, Weber wrote, "I begin to wonder if this land's true strength is not its weapons but its heart. Their freedom is not disorder. It is the belief that decency needs no command." Harper saw the change too. The Germans weren't just obeying orders, they were taking pride in their work. The fences were straighter, the fields cleaner, the cattle handled with care. He'd never thought he'd see German soldiers arguing about how best to brand a steer, but now he did, and he couldn't help but be amused. One afternoon, as the men worked in the field, a dust storm rolled in suddenly. The sky darkened, the wind howled, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Harper called out for everyone to take cover, but Weber couldn't hear over the wind. The storm hit hard, stinging with grit. Harper pushed through it, grabbed Weber by the arm, and led him behind a wagon for shelter. When the storm passed, the two sat in the orange haze of dust and silence. Weber coughed, spat into the dirt, then looked up and said, "Sergeant Harper, in another time we could have been friends." Harper looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Ain't no rule says we can't start now." From that day, things inside the camp shifted. Harper and Weber began to talk more about flying, about cattle, about what the world might look like after the war. The men who saw them together began to copy their quiet respect. Even the guards started treating the prisoners less like enemies, more like neighbors. In a place meant for confinement, humanity had found a way to grow. And soon, it would. Tested by something no one expected. The war's end, and the radio broadcast that would break the camp's silence forever. The morning of May 8, 1945 began like any other at Camp Huntsville. The sun rose through a soft haze, the cattle loaded in the distance, and the German prisoners lined up for roll call. But the air felt strange, heavy, expectant, as if something unseen hovered over the camp. Inside the guardhouse, a corporal was fiddling with a battered army radio, trying to catch the morning transmission. The static crackled, then cleared, and a voice came through. Urgent, solemn, unmistakably American. "This is London. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally." The room went still. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed to pause. Sergeant Bill Harper froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. He knew the announcement was coming. Rumors had been circulating for days, but hearing it out loud still hit like a hammer. The war was over. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. A few guards ran across the yard shouting, "It's done!" They gave up. The prisoners, hearing the commotion, stopped working. Some looked confused, others stood frozen, shovels hanging in mid-air. Within minutes, the loudspeakers carried the official message, translated into German. The voice of a young American interpreter echoed through the camp. "Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is at an end." For a long time, no one moved. Then it happened. A shout, raw, desperate, almost animal, rose from the German compound. A few prisoners dropped their tools, others sank to their knees. Some wept openly, heads bowed, hands covering their faces. It wasn't celebration, it was collapse. Karl Weber stood among them, his face pale. He felt the world inside him crack. For years he had fought for a cause, a nation, an idea. And now it was gone. Not defeated in honor, but shattered, disgraced, exposed. The Reich he had sworn loyalty to no longer existed. He stared at the dirt, feeling the weight of it all. Then he heard the faint hum of that same radio again. The American announcer now read from President Truman's speech, "This is a victory of freedom over tyranny, of human dignity over oppression." Weber felt something break inside him. He didn't cry at first. He just stood there trembling, as if his body refused to accept that history had moved on without him. He walked over quietly, watching the men in silence. Some of the guards cheered, others just looked bewildered. For Harper, there was no joy in what he saw, only a strange kind of sorrow. These men weren't enemies anymore, they were just broken souls a long way from home. He spotted Weber sitting by the fence, staring into nothing. Harper approached slowly, crouched beside him, and offered his canteen. "It's over," Harper said softly. Weber nodded, his voice hollow. "For you, maybe. For us, there is nothing left." Harper looked out toward the horizon where the sun was just beginning to climb. "There's always something left," he said. "You're still breathing, ain't you? That means you got a start." Turned to him. "A start for what?" Harper shrugged. "For whatever comes next. You can't live in the ashes forever." The German looked down, eyes glistening. Then quietly he whispered, "Sergeant Harper, do you know what they made me build?" Harper frowned. "What do you mean?" Weber hesitated, as if fighting a war inside his own head. Then he said it in Peenemünde. "I worked on rockets, V2S, weapons meant to destroy London." The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Harper didn't speak. Weber went on. "We thought they would win the war for us, but they were just killing machines. I watched them test one. It fell short. It hit a German village instead." He clenched his fists. "That's when I knew we were damned." Harper took a long breath, then said quietly, "Well, looks like you've got a chance to do something different now." In that moment, the cowboy and the Luftwaffe officer, two men who had been trained to hate each other, sat side by side in the dust, listening to the faint radio crackle of victory speeches and swing music. The war in Europe was over, but for the first time peace had a human face, and in the Texas sun it looked like mercy. That night, long after the camp had gone quiet, the lights in the command office still burned. Sergeant Harper sat across from his superior, Captain Miles, recounting what Weber had told him. The captain leaned forward, expression sharp. He admitted to working on the V2 program. Harper nodded, said he was part of the team at Peenemünde, sounded like he was done keeping it secret. Miles whistled under his breath. "That's not some factory. That's where they built the rockets that hit London. Thousands dead." He rubbed his chin, then added, "If he's telling the truth, the War Department will want to hear every word." The next morning, Weber was escorted to a small office at the edge of the compound. A portable recorder sat on the desk, wires snaking into a box marked Signal Corps property. Two officers waited with notebooks open. Harper stood by the door, arms folded. For the first few minutes, Weber barely spoke. His hands shook as he adjusted his glasses. The Americans were patient. They didn't threaten. They just listened. Finally, Weber exhaled and began. He described the base at Peenemünde, the concrete launch pads hidden under camouflage nets, the long assembly lines of sleek grey rockets. He spoke of engineers working through the night under the glare of floodlights, of technicians too scared to disobey orders, of the constant pressure to build faster, deadlier, more efficient weapons. "Did you know what the rockets were used for?" one officer asked. Weber hesitated, then nodded. We all knew. We pretended we didn't, but we knew. The room stayed silent, except for the faint hum of the recorder. Weber continued, his voice low, trembling between guilt and relief. We called it the weapon of vengeance. But after the first test went wrong and killed our own people, I started to see it for what it was. Madness wearing the mask of science. Harper watched from the side, arms still crossed, eyes fixed on the man who had once been his enemy. He saw no arrogance, no pride, just a human being trying to make peace with what couldn't be undone. When the session ended, Weber looked exhausted, hollowed out. As the guards prepared to escort him back to the barracks, he turned to Harper. "Why are you being kind to me after what I told you? You should hate me." Harper shook his head slowly. "I don't waste hate on men trying to do right after doing wrong. That's what the good Lord's for." The words hit harder than interrogation. Weber blinked, his throat tightening. "In Germany, mercy is weakness," he said quietly. "In Texas," Harper replied, "it's the start of something better." Later that week, Washington sent orders. VBR's testimony had been verified. His information confirmed details Allied intelligence had been missing for months. The fuel mixture, the launch methods, the underground storage tunnels. The data was invaluable. But what struck the officers most was how freely he gave it. When they asked why, Weber gave a simple answer. "Because one man treated me as a human being." The phrase made its way up the chain of command, appearing in a debrief report titled Voluntary Cooperation from Pinamunda Engineer Camp, Huntsville, Texas. For Harper, it meant little beyond the fact that he'd done what felt right. But for Weber, it meant redemption. As days turned into weeks, he began helping American officers organize the camp's technical library, translating captured German documents. He even helped teach English to fellow PWs, preparing for repatriation. The man who had once built weapons of vengeance now helped build understanding. Sometimes, late at night, he and Harper would sit outside the barracks watching the stars. The desert sky seemed infinite. Weber once pointed upward and said, "You know, Sergeant, the same science that made rockets could take men to those stars someday, if only we used it for something better." Harper smiled faintly. Maybe that's the first real mission worth flying. In that quiet moment, the war between them ended completely. The Texas dawn came with that soft golden light that made even barbed wire look like spun copper. Camp Huntsville was waking up. The smell of coffee drifted from the mess hall. Guards yawned and stretched. Prisoners gathered for roll call, but there was something different in the air. A stillness, as if the war had finally exhaled its last breath. Karl Weber stood by the fence, hands in his pockets, watching the sunlight spill across the fields. He had not slept. The night before he'd written the longest journal entry of his life, trying to make sense of what had happened, the confession, the forgiveness, the strange new peace that had settled over him. "I came here a prisoner," he had written, "but today I feel more free than I ever did in Germany." Sergeant Bill Harper walked up behind him, holding 2 tin mugs of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said. Weber accepted it with a nod. They stood side by side, watching a herd of cattle graze just beyond the fence line. "You'll be going home soon," Harper said after a moment. "Word is they're starting to ship PS back across the Atlantic." Weber looked down into his coffee. "Home," he murmured. "If it still exists." Harper sipped and said, "Home ain't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you learn who you are." Weber turned to him, trying to find words. "You've treated me better than I deserve, Sergeant. I can't forget that." Harper looked at him and said simply, "Then don't. Just do something good with it." It was a simple exchange, but for Weber it meant more than medals or victory parades. It was the first time since the war began that he felt like a man again, not a number in a uniform. That afternoon, something remarkable happened. The local ranchers, many of whom had employed the German PSWs in their fields, organized a small farewell meal. They brought smoked brisket, bread, and even a crate of Coca-Cola. The prisoners were allowed to attend, supervised but unchained. The men sat together in the open field, Texans and Germans, guards and prisoners sharing food under the same sun. Harper was there laughing with one of the ranchers, while VBA sat quietly at first, unsure if it was real. Then a rancher's wife walked over and handed him a plate. "You worked hard for us," she said softly. "Least we can do is feed you, right?" Weber accepted the plate with both hands, his eyes lowering in gratitude. Across the table. Harper lifted his cup. "To peace," he said. Weber raised his, hesitating for just a moment before repeating, "To peace." When the meal ended, the ranchers began to pack up, and the Germans lined up to return to camp. But as Weber walked toward the trucks, Harper called out to him, "Hey, hold up!" Weber turned. Harper took off his ST Sun, the same one he had once placed on Weber's head when he collapsed months earlier, and held it out. "Something tells me you'll need this more than I do," Harper said with a faint smile. Weber froze, unsure what to do. Slowly he reached out and accepted the hat. His voice broke slightly. "Sergeant Harper, I cannot take this." "You already did once," Harper replied. "Consider it a loan until the next war, if there ever is one." Weber smiled through tears, a rare, unguarded smile. "If there is, I hope we're on the same side." Harper extended his hand. Weber took it firmly. Two enemies who had learned in the heart of war what peace really meant. The next morning the trucks departed. Dust rose from the tires as the convoy rolled toward the horizon. Weber looked back through the wooden slats one last time. Harper stood by the gate, hand raised, the dawn light behind him. The war was over, but something far greater had begun. The quiet, lasting peace that only forgiveness can build. In the years to come, Weber would return to Germany, rebuild his life, and teach engineering. He never forgot that cowboy or the gift of that hat. On his office wall hung a small photograph taken years later. Weber standing in a Texas field wearing a Sun under an open sky. He titled it simply, "The Day I Learned What Freedom Means."